So let's talk about wilderness. We're going to be reading and talking about discussing ideas, philosophies of wilderness, wildness this week. So I've got you reading Jack Turner's The Abstract Wild, A Rant, Wendell Berry's Preserving Wildness, Edward Abbey's Freedom and Wilderness, Wilderness and Freedom, and then a few pieces from the Earth First movement of the 1980s, especially things written by David Foreman. We'll talk a little bit about that as well. This is an aspect of the class where we want to talk about wildness and wilderness. We've been talking about that, of course, plenty during the semester when we're reading Aldo Leopold, when we're reading E.O. Wilson's Half Earth. We're talking about biodiversity. We're talking about habitat, wilderness areas, wildlands. All of this is relevant to the environmental ethics course that we're in right now, but especially this week we're going to focus just on ideas of wilderness and wildness and the arguments for wilderness and for wildness. So you read Jack Turner. If you read Jack Turner, his idea is that the wilderness itself and wildness itself is something that's become an abstraction for modern Americans. He talks about the difference between the sacred and the profane, and the sacred is the thing that you would devote your life to protect. And he talks about the famous the Kaaba, which is the giant monolithic black stone in Jeddah, in Mecca, in Saudi Arabia, that all Muslims are expected at some point in their life to try to make a hijra, to make a pilgrimage to Mecca. And he talks about that place, that site being sacred, and he talks about how pilgrims would probably dismember and kill somebody who tried to destroy or harm that sacred site. And he thinks that we don't have close enough connection to wilderness anymore to have that sense of feeling that emotion about wilderness, which is what he finds a problem. And that's why he talks about abstract wilderness. I will point out, if you read that piece, he comes back to a section of Thoreau, who Emma Maris, who we read Emma Maris's beginning to her book Rambunctious Garden. And then in that second chapter, she talks about how when she's arguing against trying to get back to a baseline, and she makes the claim there that Thoreau was frightened by wilderness and wildness, and it's really totally inaccurate. Which is one of the reasons why I found her book to be less than satisfactory when I read a complete misrepresentation of Thoreau's great essay called Katahdin, which is about hiking into what is currently Baxter State Park, modern-day Baxter State Park in Maine, central Maine, and Mount Katahdin is the highest peak in Maine. And Thoreau, and at the end of Jack Turner's essay, where he cites, he doesn't name who the source is, but it is the end of Thoreau's essay Katahdin, where he's talking about contact, and it's the same passage that Emma Maris is claiming Thoreau finds wilderness scary from, and it's not at all. If you read Jack Turner, he's got exactly the right idea about what Thoreau is talking about when he's in contact with the wild up on top of this mountain. It's a place that puts him in connection with the universe. He's touching the surface of a star, basically, he says. And so he finds contact in wilderness, which is pretty much what Turner is arguing for, is that we need contact with wilderness, and if we don't have it, if we're only watching Disney shows on television and other things like that, we're not really connected to wilderness. Another perspective on wilderness that you read is Wendell Berry's, and he talks about how there are people who argue for the idea of wilderness and preservation of wilderness, and he's writing that also in the mid-'80s, that essay Preserving Wildness, and he is a pretty good friend of Edward Abbey's, who you're going to be reading for the end of this week. Even though he's doesn't get involved in Earth First or any of that sort of thing like Abbey does, he is a real advocate for wildness, and he is a great writer. He's still alive. A novelist, poet, and he is a guy who, in spite of the fact that he had this brilliant career laid out in front of him, he met Edward Abbey. They went to the Wallace Stegner Fellowship, a year-long fellowship in creative writing at Stanford back in the early 60s, and he or maybe it was the 50s even, but he and Berry were both promising writers, and Barry decided to move back to Kentucky to take up the old family farm that had fallen into desuetude. So it was pretty much a wrecked farm, kind of like what Aldo Leopold did when he moved back to this, when he bought the place in the Sand Counties where he and his family would go up from Madison, where he taught at the University of Wisconsin. They'd go up there and work on the weekends. That's what you see him writing about in the Sand County. Similar kind of thing with Wendell Berry. And so this is his idea. This is let's say this is the Berry family farm, and his argument is that there are those people who say now, when he's writing that in the 80s, that the economists, the cornucopian economists, are people who claim that everything that we need is here. We don't need to preserve things. Technology will get us through. And he talks about a kind of abstract economics. And he said that preservationists believe we need to stop destroying wilderness. And he says that he would find himself in favor of the preservationists. He would be in that camp. But he says that he thinks there's really a third position. So he sees these two poles. The argument is that there's these two poles, the environmentalists and the economists. And he says that there's a third position, which is this position of the margins. And so to give you an idea of what that means, if this is a farm, it's an agricultural production area. It is culture in the most important way. A farm is an aspect of culture. It is humans creating a place where they can take hybridized food products. You make corn. You use machinery. It's where artifice takes over the wild. And on the outside, if this is let's say this is the fence line for his farm, you really have to kind of keep the wild out so that you can produce your agriculture, right? You can produce your beets, your corn, you can run your still and make your moonshine, whatever. And the wild is on the outside of that, but there's the margin is what's between the wild and culture. And what he says is that we're at a point now where we need culture to keep the wild safe, to preserve the wild, but we also need the wild to keep culture safe. And what he means by that is human beings are themselves from a wild stock. Everything that we eat and all the food that we create has come from the wild. We've domesticated it and turned it into what it is today. Corn is, of course, grass, and so is wheat. Those are forms of grass that we have hybridized to the point where they are now. You can imagine that the roots that make up today's potatoes, these are the kinds of things that in Peru, where people experimented with hybridizing the different roots that they would make these potatoes out of. And so these are both New World crops: maize, corn, and potatoes. And that's an aspect of culture in the most serious way. And he argues that now that we're at this point where we need to protect wildness is also something that we need in our culture to keep us safe and to keep us whole. That's his argument. The other arguments that I want you to read is Edward Abbey has a political argument for wilderness. And I want to talk just for a minute about wilderness. There is an official act. The Wilderness Act was signed into law by Lyndon Johnson in 1964. There it is, September 3rd, 1964. And I put a bunch of sites up for you. There's also this is Rewilding the Earth. This is the Rewilding Institute, and this is an organization that was founded by David Foreman, who was also one of the co-founders, along with Abbey and some others, of Earth First back in the 1980s. And here's a map. I thought was a really nice map. It's from the University of Montana. I was talking with Stefano today when we met, and here we are up here. These are wilderness areas, and as you scroll around on this, it's a GIS map, so it gives you all kinds of information. This is Montana. You can see that most of the wilderness in the United States is going to be out west, and there's some back east. You'll find some, but this Class 1 wilderness, the big wilderness areas, like that's the Bob Marshall Wilderness or the River of No Return Wilderness, Frank Church. Here we are. There's the Marble Mountain Wilderness, and there's the Trinity Alps. So we live in an area that's surrounded by wilderness, as you all know. So anyway, this is a good map. Some people say now is that wilderness is rocks and ice. It's just limited to these high peaks. Like there's the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness, and this is all through the Bitterroot Mountains, down through the Sawtooth, and and here's in Montana. This is where I used to live over near Missoula, and this would be the Bob Marshall Wilderness, the Scapegoat Wilderness, Mission Mountain Wilderness, Spotted Bear Wilderness. These are all the wilderness areas in the lower 48 states. So here's another good map, and you can take a look at that map as well. And here's a Forest Service map that is also, you can go state by state to look up different wilderness areas. But let's get back to our course module. And so when I ask you about wilderness, we talk about questions. The questions that I would ask you are, what is wilderness for? What is wilderness good for? What's Wendell Berry's answer to that? What does Jack Turner believe? And I asked you to read a short section from Leopold, Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac. I think there's one other reading that we have in there, but I'll make sure that I put that, notify you about what exactly those pages are, since we're into our coronavirus crisis right now, and you're not operating from the regular syllabus. So. These are the three kind of reasons why Leopold believes we need wilderness. And Abby's question for why do we need wilderness? What's the relationship between wilderness and civilization? And he asks this question, who gives us the permission to live the way we do? And his point is that we have pulled ourselves out of civilization. We've created civilization out of wilderness. And his concern is regarding authoritarianism. He calls it his nightmare. So what is Edward Abbey's idea about the value of wilderness? He talks about wilderness being our home. And this is something that you'll see in the brief intro to an Earth First guide that Abbey helped David Foreman and others put together. This Earth First in the 1980s, it's not true anymore, but Earth First in the 1980s was advocating for such things as tree spiking, destruction of machinery. Basically, you would call it industrial sabotage. And for those of you who don't know the term sabotage, where it comes from, it actually comes from the old French wooden shoe, the sabot. And in the height of the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in the late 18th century, when they were taking the looms that they made all the woolen products out of and the cotton materials out of, they were transforming those looms into steam looms, to the first engine-driven looms. And it put people out of work, of course, because it had been a hand loom or something that you operated with your feet. And this is something that these people would throw their wooden shoes into the machine works, into the gears, and that's where we get the word sabotage. And that's exactly what some of this stuff that you're reading about in Earth First is about. So these people are claiming that the wilderness is something that's so vitally important, it is in a sense our home, and it needs to be protected. So take a look at that, think about that. What is the value of wilderness? Is this kind of tree spiking that people were talking about, is it a form of terrorism? Is it eco-terrorism, as people are claiming? Is that different from sitting in trees like Julia Butterfly Hill did up here in Humboldt County back in the 1990s? What do we make of this sort of activity that people are in Earth First were at that time describing? What is the value of wilderness? Let's talk about that in our discussion boards for this week.